Okay, so here I want to talk to you about adding more shadows. So if you notice, if I toggle off this blue line, there's our ink scene, and it's not reading too poorly, but the lines are a little faint in certain areas. So I like to be aware of that. So it's a good idea to kind of just look at your inks without the sketch lines to see where you're really at. And that's why you also want to get in here and not really use too many thin lines, even with something that's got more detail like this. Remember, you want the thicker lines up close, like we got here, and I'm going to implement more of that. But also, you just want to use some shapes of shadows throughout. So one of the things I like to do is actually draw in, some shapes of shadows. So I might first sketch the line. I might think that, maybe this has a shadow over the top on the side. And you might think, well, generally shadows are on the bottom, and that's true. But since this is a very heavily lit scene from the bottom up, you could really play around with that concept. You could, make your shadows. Shadows are almost always going to be in the recessed areas of objects like this. But then I just feel like with all the screens that I could really bring the light source from the bottom up. Now I also like to turn back the opacity. And mainly the reason why is I just feel like I can see into the work a little bit more and play around with the concept. So I might do something like this, get in some of these shadows. Now, the thing I'm trying to do too is propel certain parts of this illustration off the edges. So for instance, as these things overlap, I feel like if I do more of the little bits of information in between, and shadows like here, a little bit back here, again, kind of start from the top of this, show some of the segmentation of the gadgetry or whatever. But I feel like each time I do this, I'm going to push this further. So for instance, if I bring that to full visibility, you can see it's real messy. I've got to clean it up, but it reads a bit more apparent from a distance. So, with and without. So just play around with that concept. It really does have a pretty good size impact. Another way I like to do this is with the blue line method like this. I don't know why, it just seems to look kind of neat to me visually. And then as I add to this, I can see through it a bit better. So I just like it. And then, right there, if I put that shadow there, it basically propels this piece of machinery forward. Okay, so that's really the basis of it. So if I put a drop shadow here, it's going to make this area raised. And actually that wouldn't even be a drop shadow, I don't think. But again, if I put a shadow here, it's going to raise this area. If I put a shadow here, it's going to push this up. Now you don't simply just want to put shadows randomly wherever because you're trying to propel certain things off the page. I mean, sometimes you will, but really you're just trying to think about where they would really go, keep your light source in mind. But other times you do just do things because they look cool. That's just comics. Okay, so now I might put a little bit of shading inside of here, again, to kind of make that look more depthy. A drop shadow below here. Now these I would consider drop shadows or cast shadows from these bits of machinery or whatever. Now I can also do that with things in the back here. So I could texturize and put like these little darker wires and circuitries and cables and things like that back there. I can also change the silhouette or edging of some of this stuff by bringing it over, and now it looks like it connects to, I should probably be a little bit tighter to show you that, but I can do some stuff where it comes in and now it looks like it connects to the side of this. So I can keep detailing with this effect if I want. I really don't want to do too much of that since I'm trying to kind of do this in a reasonable amount of time. And the other thing is I'm going to really beef up these lines for the things that are closer to our viewer. So just keep that in mind. If some of these lines are too faint, they should start thinner over here near the door. And as they get closer to the frame here, they should be a lot heavier. So we want to make sure that by the time we're done inking that shows. So let's go ahead and do some more of these shadows over here. You see on this side, I kind of started to implement more of what I'm talking about now, but there's still a few areas, like I would add some right here. Now keep in mind too, these same shadows we're talking about are also great for focal points. So you want to think about lots of different ways to direct your viewer. And it can be more detail in a certain area. It can be heavier shadows. It can be a different style of rendering than the rest of the scene. So there's lots of ways to really pull the viewer. Like for instance, if you work on a dark scene and you add in white highlights or really colorful scene and there's just a few white highlights, then that's going to drive your focal point. And that's the same thing with, you want to think of that in terms of inking as well. I think I might block this out. Yeah, something like that. I put a shadow under it. Well, there's already kind of shadow there. So a shadow and then some line breaks. And we're going to talk about the rendering next, a little cross hatching and details throughout the scene. But let's go ahead and clean this up now. So what I like to do, you could probably, if you're pretty good at this, you could really just go through with what's here and ink it one more time over top of the same layer. I like to just tone that layer back. And I could jump over to the main inks layer now or just add one more layer and then merge them together after I'm done. But I just feel like this helps me to get a little bit cleaner representation of what I'm looking for. Now the other thing I like to do here is I'll sculpt the inks by drawing them in. Fill in this shape. So for instance, if I just make sure all my edges are connected, remember this is a floating layer. So we got to be careful of that. And then I'll probably just get all of this shape or this one device. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So I'll ink all this in. And I like to draw these shapes now at this point. If you notice when I first placed these, I was kind of scribbling them in or just blobbing them in there. But as I come back, I like to draw the perimeter shape first. And I feel like that gives me a cleaner representation. I also feel like it helps me study the shapes that I'm implementing and therefore kind of make them more consistent. So I feel like I want to see this whole edge over here in shadow. Again, I just feel like it adds more depth. So another thing I want to make sure to mention in these lessons, don't be afraid to really alter the artwork. I mean, especially if it's your own, that's should go without saying, but you really want to experiment and alter things at this stage of the work. Inking is not tracing. Hopefully I've said that throughout these lessons, but it's not. It's so not tracing. It's adding another level of creative style and interpretation to it. So make sure to play around with these concepts and really stretch what you've put down. Don't just make the bad mistake of just copying what's in front of you and calling it done when you can add so much more to it in this process. So I think I'll put a shadow here. So you see I'm just kind of pinballing around now. I think some of this I might be adding, but I think that was kind of already in this area. But look how all these little shapes now, if I put these little shapes on the side right here, it raises up that area next to it. So again, kind of draw out this shape and then fill it in. Little bits here and there. And I think I'll leave like a small light gap right there to make it look like you can see the edge of that next material. But then as we get down here, I'll have it fade off. Maybe do a little bit of rendering there in the next lesson. And again, like I said, here you can change the shape a little bit, add in some additional details. Make it look like all this stuff is kind of connected together. And then I can turn this opacity back a little bit and I can go back with a translucent brush and I can try to figure out where there would be a little bit of light source hitting some of these parts of the gadgetry or whatever. Little tech lines that I like to overdo. But just like that, you can make this a bit more interesting. And put that to full opacity, and it just adds a little bit more detail to that. So same thing, every time I add a little bit of shape of shadow here, it's going to push that next object forward. All right, and let's go ahead and wrap up right here. We'll go to the next lesson, continue to add in our shadows, and again, make this scene a bit more vibrant by doing so. So with that, let's move on.